Thanks for coming. I imagine that just listening to you, some of you are quite experienced in interpretation already, and you may even know who I am. In fact, we might very well have met in the past. And in fact, in two cases, I know we have. And others of you, I suspect, are a little bit newer to the field and are justifiably wondering why I've been asked to say a few words to you about the course you're about to take, and also about your way forward on your personal professional path to excellence in interpretation. The first thing I think I want you to know about me is that I'm an interpreter. When you read all that things in my bio about university work and publications and so forth, you might get the feeling that, well, yeah, but has the guy ever done my job? I assure you, I have. I have seen myself as an interpreter since 1971. I was just 2 years out of high school when I was inspired to become an interpreter after one I could only describe as a magical evening at Jenny Lake at a campfire program in Grand Teton National Park, where I decided there that night that that's what I wanted to do for a living. And I guess it turned into something quite different and bigger and more amazing than I ever imagined. But I never looked back from that, and I'm glad to be able to say that. And since those early days, I've been what you'd call, I guess, in today's vernacular, a frontline interpreter. It sounds so military, doesn't it? Frontline, but because in some ways, I guess there is a battle going on for the hearts and minds of people. But I've been a frontline interpreter for city parks, county parks, state parks, national parks, and national forests, one national wildlife refuge, a wildlife park, museum, and a consultant and trainer now for many, many years for hundreds of government organizations and private tourism businesses mainly, but other types of business as well, all over the USA and Canada, and as you just heard, in about 60 countries. It's been quite a wonderful professional path that I've been fortunate enough to travel working with the best people on the planet who tend to be interpreters. But you also know that I've enjoyed a very active and I would say a rewarding 4-decade career as a university professor, teaching interpretation and communication psychology and doing research on them. And I should add about the teaching part that, you know what, I wasn't just a good teacher. As it turned out, objectively, apparently, I was much better than that. I've even been told recently, actually, that I still am, but that's for others to decide. Dozens of my students and I still stay in contact. I mean, that's an amazing thing, isn't it? After you've been retired as long as I have, and many of them are retired after having enjoyed very successful careers, and yet here we all still are in contact. And I would have to say, if any of you are teachers or have taught, that's a really, really nice reward that simply isn't available to most people in most professions outside of teaching. My special approach to teaching university students, when it was recognized by other professors, my colleagues and administrators on campus, never forget those administrators, I was eventually nominated for, and amazingly won, my university's highest award, the most coveted award for a teacher, the University of Idaho's Award for Teaching Excellence, which, by the way, came with a nice cash reward too that I hadn't expected. Anyway, on the day of the ceremony, I'm getting to something here with this story. On the day of the ceremony, when the president of the university handed me the plaque and the check, which, by the way, I then turned around the next day and used as part of a down payment for my daughter's first car. The president of the university asked me in front of a small group of others, some other professors, and a few people from the local print and broadcast journalism field, reporters. Right? She asked me, what had I done to become such a good teacher? Because I said President Zinser, Elizabeth Zinser was her name. I said, President Zinser, really nothing special. I just practice what I preach in my classes. And I think that took her off guard just a little bit. And I added, I said, but you know, a lot of what I preach isn't what a lot of other professors necessarily think has to do with formal classroom teaching. That really created some interest in the group, and not just from the president and the other professors, but also those journalists. And I'll tell you more about that now. I said to her and the others, you know, look, I'm what one profession I know would call an interpreter. And so immediately then the question was asked, well, what's that? And just exactly what are you preaching? Have followed my work at all, and I don't presume that you have. But if you have, you would probably have already guessed that what I was preaching then in my courses on interpretation, and now today as I speak to you, was nothing more than the TOR model of thematic interpretation. The TORE model. We'll come back to those letters that you're going to learn a lot more about in the coming days from your instructors. Those comments to the president seem to generate some interest, not only from her, as I said, but from the other professors and the reporters, because reporters, journalists, just like teachers and interpreters, also make a living by communicating with other people. And so at their insistence, I then proceeded to explain to all those folks standing kindly around me that while teaching and interpretation were both aimed at learning, they're often based on different ideas about the outcomes of interest, you know, the indicators of success. And I added that while teaching often, and we all know this, having been students, and possibly some of us still are in the formal sense, while teaching often emphasizes students remembering what the teacher said, remembering what they were assigned to read perhaps, and other things. Interpretation, on the other hand, and this is a subtle but important difference, is more focused on motivating audiences to want to learn, to motivating them to want to learn by making the content that we present to them relevant to their personal lives. What I long ago, as some of you might know, what I long ago termed vitamin R, load your interpretation with vitamin R, R for relevance, by engaging your audiences and most of all, getting them to think their own thoughts and make their own meanings, not just absorb the meanings that we give them, but getting them to do the thinking wherein they create their own subjective meanings for things and see personal relevance in it. This is when, in this explanation, this young journalist, he was the TV journalist, gave me a knowing, revealing nod of agreement. I could tell that the penny had just dropped, the light bulb had just switched on, and that made me very happy. And he and I actually became friends for quite a while after that. You see, this interpretation stuff doesn't just apply to the tourism industry, as you'll hear from me in a while. It applies to all forms of communication, obviously including classroom teaching. So you're probably wondering about the letters, aren't you? The T, the O, the R, and the E. I'm not sure what you've read ahead of time in the previous iteration. The people in the CIG certification process would do a literature review, and you would read my work along with the work of other authors, you know, the seminal literature in your field, and you would know some of this going into CIG. So what I'm attempting to do today is sort of give you the benefit of an introduction to what then you're going to learn about in more detail from your instructors. But these four letters, T, O, R, and E, are just letters that describe the four qualities that communication for a voluntary audience, what I call a non-captive audience, an audience that is free to not pay attention, they will pay attention only if they want to. They know there won't be an exam. They know there's no pass or fail associated with this event. If they don't like what they're hearing or seeing, they'll just tune you out mentally or leave you physically. Now, that's the non-captive audience. That these are the qualities communication for this type of voluntary audience must have in order to stand the greatest chance of success. Success being defined as, one, holding the audience's attention long enough to make a thought-provoking point. And then having made that, and then having held that attention long enough, then making that thought-provoking point. Back in the, and this will really age me, but you can tell by the color and quantity of my hair that I deserve that moniker, that back in the 80s, now over 40 years ago, I first developed this TOR model as a researcher. Originally, it was called the EROT framework. EROT is TORE spelled backwards. And there's a story to why I later switched them around, and we can talk about that afterwards if you like. But today it's called the TOR model. But I developed this EROT framework from compiling what then was more than a century. No, it didn't take me a century, and no, I'm not that old yet. But studies going back as far as a century beforehand, on up and through the current day, including 2023, as I'm speaking these words, communication research that has demonstrated empirically with consistent findings how communication of any form can plausibly, not possibly, but plausibly, conceivably influence a human being thinking, how they feel, and sometimes how they behave. And that is what thematic interpretation is. And so none of this TOR approach to thematic interpretation is just made up or invented like a lot of things that people think about communication. We have our own experience. We communicate every day, so we have a lot of experience, and we form subjective, personal opinions about how communication works best. A lot of that comes from our experience in interpersonal communication contexts, right? But here we're talking about communicating with an aggregate, with audiences of people who are not like us in some ways. In other ways, we're all alike. But yes, the TOR model is based on theory. In fact, a lot of theory, but it's theory that has been substantiated by so many studies that its validity, I mean, and its practicality, its practical usefulness for an interpreter is a virtual no-brainer. So there's quite a lot we can be confident about with this approach. Much later, and then now we're talking about the 2000s, so up to about 23 years ago, and then later, then came a series of organizations and authors that began to add to TOR, to the 4 letters, and rearrange them and add other letters in order to give the core, the TOR core, as it were, right, a broader professional context for whatever purposes and types of professions they were trying to deal with. And in interpretation, we saw in the book, Conducting Meaningful Interpretation, a brilliant book, by the way, published by Fulcrum Publishing, which is also my publisher, by Carolyn Ward and Brian Wilkinson. They created the acronym CREATES. They took the EROT or TORE and turned the O into an S, and I'll tell you why later. O is organization, S is structure, and created the acronym CREATES, but it still had the core of TOR. And then later, and this was inevitable, remember the first iteration was the EROT framework? Well, I didn't notice it. It was pointed out to me actually years later in Alaska by somebody in one of my workshops, and then I started telling the story, and then it became everybody's goal to figure out how to add an I and a C to EROT, because EROT is 2/3 of erotic. And so one after another they tried, and finally one of them was published in a journal on distance learning by a couple of Australian professors years later, and they call it the erotic model of distance learning based on TOR. And then I think about 2008, so even later came NAI, and they saw quickly that, well, T-O-R-N-E, well, you could just add a P and a Y and get poetry. And so, this is how these work. The acronym became the end in itself. But in NAI's case, the acronym was real and significant because the two letters that were added to the core TOR, right, are important for a professional interpreter, actually a professional of any kind. And the first is a P, which stands for purposeful, which is just saying that your work, your interpretation should be consistent with the mission of the organization you represent, or sometimes your personal goals. If you're a private freelance guy, well, then you're the organization. But it should be purposeful. It should have an outcome that of interest. That it should stand to produce benefits, right? That you are dedicated personally or organizationally to producing. And then the Y stands for you. All of you, the professional interpreter, who's an individual who is constantly growing and learning and becoming a person who is on the path and constantly the path to success and the path to achieving excellence. And this is a lifelong learning process, and that's what the Y is for. And so I am quite happy with these being added to TOR, much better than I was with the I and the C. Which seemed kind of arbitrary, and I am totally supportive of them, and so I'm happy that they are part of what sort of the ribbon that goes around the four letters that I'm responsible for, and this has been a great partnership with NAI over many decades now. But do appreciate that these other acronyms contain those four letters TORE, because TOR is the applied part of all the acronyms. It's the part it's what you do as an interpreter that needs to be good. You need to be good at doing these four letters. And you need to be good at doing them if you want to stand the greatest chance of achieving the kind of difference that you personally and organizationally want to make. So now I want to focus on those four letters a little bit, because they are, as I said, the core, the heart of poetry. While the P and Y add context to what interpretation and interpreters themselves should be, the TOR and E have to do with how your interpretation can be successful, how to interpret at your highest level, and how, as a subtitle of my, you saw the cover of my book, most recent book, the subtitle of that book says, it's how you do your work can make a difference on purpose. Not by simply crossing your fingers and hoping to get lucky, as if interpretation were some kind of gimmicky magic trick, but rather as a matter of strategic, professional, premeditated intent, by applying a methodology and an approach that is based on an empirically demonstrated understanding of the pathways and the mechanisms, the how, the technique, the methodology, through which your interpretation can conceivably make a difference in another human being's life. That is, making a difference on purpose. Now, here we go with the letters. What's that T? Well, you already know that T is for thematic. Which means that you have a strongly relevant theme in mind, or what I just call a strong theme. A strong theme is a theme that already produces the outcome of interest, which is provocation, stimulating people to think their own thoughts and make their own meanings. A strong theme without any further development or embellishment, a strong theme accomplishes that. That's the place where every interpreter should start producing an interpretive product, a talk, a guided tour, an exhibit, a kiosk, a multimedia program, a Facebook page, whatever it is. That's where you start, is with a strong theme. This is work up front that you do, but man, when you have this theme, your work gets a lot easier and your task is much narrowed. And this is a thought, this idea, you can think of it as an overarching idea. You can think of it as a message. I prefer actually these days to call it the moral of the story that you would like people to extract, not necessarily to agree with it, not necessarily to be able to remember it or restate it or regurgitate it later on an exam, for example, but rather you want it to produce thoughts so that their thoughts will hover around that theme. In other words, this theme is a platform for your audiences to think on. That's what thematic interpretation is. And if anybody tells you it's something different, they either don't understand it or they're making it up. And you heard it from the horse, his mouth. The only caring that any human being, any of us, is even capable of doing has to come from somewhere, doesn't it? Well, the only caring we can do will come from the thoughts that we ourselves think between our own two ears, even if those thoughts are wrong or factually challenged or somehow just erroneous. They still nevertheless are the only source, or the source of the only caring that we're capable of doing. Right. And so the interpreter's job is not to tell people what to care about. It's not to tell them what meanings matter most. It's to get them to make their own meanings about things. And so that's just going to leave that there. And then you will take this forward in several more steps forward in the coming days. Let's go to the O now. The O stands for organized. And we know a lot about organization, and I know it in the CIG curriculum. The O is mainly going to emphasize the importance of introductions, bodies, and conclusions when you're giving in a presentation, like a face-to-face interpretive event of some kind, a talk or guided tour, what have you, right? But it also involves much more than that. That comes from cognitive psychology and the concept of cognitive load, how much information human beings can simultaneously keep sorted out in their heads before they get lost or worn out, or both, right? And so just think of the O as this. Your interpretation is organized when it's easy to follow, when it's easy to process, when people aren't having to work hard. A voluntary audience won't work very hard for very long before they just tune you out or physically leave. So make it easy to follow. There are two stars that must align according to dozens of studies before you stand the greatest chance of stimulating thinking, provoking thought, which is what you want to do. There are two stars that need to align empirically. This is one of them, the O. Now, what's the second star? It's the next letter. It's the R. R for relevance, vitamin R. You already saw that your theme should be strongly relevant, an idea that's already thought-provoking, but also the rest of your presentation of that theme, as well as the theme, need to make connections to things that already matter to your audience. Things your audience already cares about, right? That's what being relevant is. It's not just stuff they already know about, it's stuff they care about, stuff that matters in their lives. Now, you're going to learn in the coming days about intangible meanings. You're going to learn about tangible meanings as well, but these intangible meanings are things that represent something to an audience. And they are a class of a very special set of concepts called universal concepts. Universal concepts, intangible meanings could differ from audience to audience, but there's a class of intangibles called universal concepts that, as far as we know, have always had special significance for human beings, everywhere, all cultures, and for all time. And so when you're learning about intangibles and universal concepts, do think back to the R, because these things are a fast track to relevance. And when you're having trouble making your interpretation relevant, go get a list or make your own list of universal concepts. And in chapter 2 of my book, I give you a long list of some examples, right? But you could make up your own. Finally, the E. Now, the E stands for enjoyable. Enjoyable to process. It doesn't mean entertaining. In fact, it's part of entertainment, but entertainment requires the O, the R, and the E. Anything that's easy to follow, matters to the audience, and is enjoyable to process will hold their attention until the cows come home, or until one of those qualities is no longer there, no longer present. So enjoyable to process, what does that mean? Well, it means that your audience finds both your communication style, or if you're working, for example, some of you work in museums or visitor centers where you do exhibits and kiosks and dioramas and things like that, the design of it But the communication package itself, whether personally presented or non-personal interpretation, should be attractive and appealing to process. And by enjoyable to process, it doesn't mean necessarily that it's uplifting. It doesn't necessarily mean it makes you smile or laugh. It doesn't mean it makes you happy or joyful. It could be very sad, could be tragic, could be violent, could be scary. Ever read a Stephen King novel recently, or a Spielberg movie? Or just watch the evening news tonight, and you'll see that what is enjoyable to process isn't necessarily uplifting. I don't know how yours goes, but the first half an hour of mine every night is about robberies and killings and awful things that human beings do. A lot of human suffering. That tends to be something that we enjoy processing. I'm just saying. Not that your interpretation would necessarily have those particular qualities. Anyway, collectively, studies show that when your interpretation possesses all four of these qualities, the T, the O, the R, and the E, at a high level of professionalism, then you stand the best chance of making the kinds of differences you want to make. You stand the best chance of success, which is holding an audience's attention long enough to make a thought-provoking point, and then making the thought-provoking point. And I should add, by the way, that this is one thing then that every professional interpreter can do on your personal path of professional development and your quest for professional excellence. And that is to constantly improve your ability to be thematic, your theme writing, your ability to incorporate universal concepts and intangible meanings into your commentaries and your themes, right? As well as how to be organized and enjoyable to process. And when you have all four of those together, I call it TOR quality. TOR quality. And I should add also, and I'm just about finished now, that this TOR model has been now it's being applied all over the world. I just wrote a book for my students in my interpretation class, and look what has become of it, because the ideas speak for themselves, and the people who practice it at a high level demonstrate it every day, its validity. It's applied in all kinds of contexts. I'll be back in April and back in Australia for the 17th consecutive year, working with one city, one municipality that wants to be a world model, sustainable city that wraps its whole strategic approach around thematic communication. Municipal national sustainability programs, philanthropy. I work a lot in philanthropy, particularly travelers philanthropy, where tourists go to a place and through a powerful thematic interpretive experience, connect strongly to the place or to a story about the place, and decide to leave a little more money dedicated to local conservation or local protection or local historic preservation. In fact, I'm still doing that. I'm trying to retire, but I love that. That work is so important. I continue to do it. And even courtroom argumentation, lawyers practice thematic communication, political campaigning, they practice it, law enforcement, and I saved the best for last because this is where I started my story today, especially classroom teaching. So I'm hoping very much, in fact, I'd say I'm counting on you to learn as much as you can in the coming days about the T, the O, R, and E in your upcoming CIG certification course, because this will mark, regardless of where you are in your career now, this will now, with respect to thematic interpretation, probably mark the point of departure, the starting point from which your personal future path towards success and excellence will begin and eventually will travel, according to everything that I know based on my own experience and, yes, a lot of research. Yes, don't forget the P and the Y. They too are very important because of the context that they give TOR. Add it to TOR, which again, TOR tells you how to interpret, how to do your job. The P and the Y tell you something absolutely significant about what it means to be an interpreter, what it means to be in your profession, what it means to have the privilege of doing your job at all. Here's to a great poetry session for you. I'm sure your instructors will deliver a course of poor quality. And I want to thank you all very much for your kind attention. Thank you.